Hey everybody, Mr. Wallowitz here to present to you the notes for the post-French and Indian War America, the seeds of unrest, the real beginning to the American Revolution as seen through Boston, Massachusetts, and eventually, as we will see as we get through the American Revolution and this pre-war period, how it will go from Boston through the other 12 colonies. We have to define these terms so that we can know them for an upcoming test that we will have eventually on the American Revolution. First, we have duty, which is an import tax. Non-importation agreement, documents signed by colonial merchants promising not to buy or import British goods. Writs of assistance, special search and warrants that allowed colonial tax collectors to search for smuggled goods. And propaganda, information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. All right, first we have here financing an empire. England is in debt after the French and Indian War. England also needed a way to tighten control over the American colonies. England needed revenue to pay for the war and turn their attention to the colonists. So war itself is a very expensive operation. More often, it costs more money than the country has on hand, and so it needs to borrow money, whether it's from banks or other countries. The countries at war will seek money somehow to help finance it. When the war is over, it is time to repay those debts. So that England needs to raise revenue somehow to help pay back any debts to whichever banks or countries they borrowed money from during the French and Indian War. At the same time, after the French and Indian War, with England issuing the Proclamation of 1763, it have made it clear that they are trying to tighten their control over the American colonies. They don't want colonists to travel west of the Appalachian Mountains. They want to keep all of the colonists confined between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean. So they're trying to find a way to have tighter control over the colonists. So they're going to try to turn their attention to taxing the American colonists so that they can raise a little bit more revenue to help finance or help pay back debts from the French and Indian War. Now, it should be stated here that England has had taxed the American colonists before, even before the French and Indian War. So these taxes that they are about to put on the American colonists are extensions of taxes that are already on the books. But the big one here is the Stamp Act of 1765. This act placed a tax on all printed materials, advertisements, diplomas, legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, etc. These materials had to be printed on a special stamped paper, or it came with a stamp attached to it. It was the first attempt to directly tax the colonists. So this Stamp Act was either all documents that were printed on paper, advertisements, diplomas, so on and so forth. Anything printed on paper needed to be printed on a special paper that was stamped, similar to like a notary public, how they would stamp your official documents today. So it would come with a stamped piece of paper like that, or it came with a similar stamp already attached to whatever you were buying. You were not paying extra for the product you were buying. You were paying extra so that it would come with a stamped piece of paper or a separate stamp. Now, like I said, that taxes have been imposed on the American colonies before, but it was mostly the colonies, not so much the colonists. And this was the first time that the British government was going to seek some sort of payment directly from individuals. Everybody who could read was going to buy the newspaper. Playing cards were a huge form of entertainment, especially in the 18th century. Legal documents, if you wanted to get married or something like that, birth certificates. They were going to have to be printed on a special material. So this wasn't something that the colonists could necessarily avoid. However, so the colonists were almost personally affected by this tax. A reaction to the Stamp Act. So reaction to the Stamp Act was led by the colonial upper class. They saw this as an opportunity to deflect lower class frustration off of them and to the British. An organization called the Committee of Correspondence, or the Sons of Liberty, is created to stir up the hatred and frustration towards the British. So the colonial upper class, and we're talking about elites of the time, are going to try to stir up the lower classes into supporting their cause to break away from England. Or at least at this time, not so much to break away from England, but to kind of get on the upper class's side about not having or wanting to pay a tax. There is class conflict at this time in colonial America, where the upper class is generating more of the wealth than the lower classes. There are fewer opportunities to become wealthy if you weren't already wealthy in colonial America. So the upper class is going to try to stir this and take it more off of them and put more blame on the British, and saying that it is British policy, as evidenced by the Stamp Act, that is keeping the lower class in poverty and preventing them from gaining wealth. And a Committee of Correspondence, a Sons of Liberty, will be an organization that is created here that will help spread propaganda through speeches, through written newspaper advertisements, newspaper articles, to try to place the blame not on the colonial upper class, but on the British government themselves. The upper class was most upset with the tax because they didn't want to lose any of the wealth that they've already attained. In order to get the lower class on their side, the Sons of Liberty made speeches and used propaganda. They used the fact that the colonies had no representation in British Parliament, so they didn't have a right to tax the colonies. So like I was saying before, the upper class, the Sons of Liberty, are going to use speeches and propaganda to try to deflect any type of hatred from the lower classes, the working classes, to blame the British, as evidenced by this tax that's going to directly affect everybody. However, the Stamp Act doesn't necessarily affect the lower class as much as it is going to affect the upper class, because the lower class isn't necessarily going to go out and try and buy newspapers. The lower classes aren't going to be trying to get as many or as much official documents as the upper class would. The upper class, who are the business owners, would need more official documents to help run their business. They're going to be affected more by this tax than would be the lower class. However, the upper class is going to use this as a chance to deflect any type of lower class frustration off of them and onto the British. They start the idea that the American colonists do not have any representation in British Parliament in London, and so they are of the opinion that you cannot tax without consent of the people. There's no taxation without representation. We didn't consent to this because we don't have any representation in Parliament, so you can't enforce this on us. So the Sons of Liberty, they're going to try to urge all colonists to boycott British goods. And it is kind of successful. The Sons of Liberty are going to encourage or demand that the colonists boycott British goods, to boycott having to buy pieces of paper or any type of paper that would be taxed. If it was manufactured by Great Britain and sold in the United States or sold in colonial America, that would be stamped. If it was paper that was made by the American colonies and distributed in that way, then maybe it's not taxed. And so the colonists are going to boycott. Propaganda, the speeches by the Sons of Liberty works enough where that the lower class buys into what the upper class is selling, that it is Great Britain's fault that they aren't given the opportunity to amass wealth like the upper class has. So they're going to help and they're going to boycott. And it works. It gets Parliament's attention. It works so much that the British Parliament is going to repeal the tax. But they are also going to come back and say, well, just because you have no physical representation in Parliament, you are all still British subjects. So you are all under the jurisdiction of the British government, and anything that the British government does through Parliament, through the King, does have to be followed by you, the subjects. So in a sense, yes, they repeal the Stamp Act. It's a victory for the American colonists, but the British are still going to try to assert their authority by saying, well, yeah, you have no physical representation, but because you are British subjects, you still do need to follow the laws presented or passed by Parliament or the King. Homework or classwork if time allows. There are questions on Google Classroom. Because this is a little late, you do not have to do the questions that go along with this. They are not necessary to complete at this time. All right, thank you for listening. Please view these on Google Slides as well, but you would get more out of it by listening to this Screencastify recording. See you next time.